Today, we're going to be looking at something that is insanely important for any guy, single or married, who is not having the kind of romantic success that he's looking for. We're going to be reacting to a portion of the Diary of a CEO podcast where the host is interviewing Esther Perel, who is apparently a famous sex therapist. Now, from my perspective, a lot of the sex therapy world is full of absolutely garbage ideas, but Ms. Perel makes some incredibly good points that expose the foundations of what is driving a lot of the romantic and sexual atrophy decline we see in the modern world today. So we're going to be breaking all that down, and then I'm going to be giving you my big practical takeaways on how you can use this knowledge to really start improving your romantic life. So let's go ahead and get into it here.
One shift that's taken place, which I'm keen to get your perspective on, relates to sex. 1 in 3 men under 30 in the US reported no sex in the past year. That's triple the rate from 2008. Millennials and Gen Zs are having less sex than any generation since records began, despite more access to the dating apps we talked about.
Yeah.
In Japan, over 40% of young adults are virgins, and many say that they have no interest in sex.
Mm-hmm.
And lastly, married couples in the UK and the United States report a steady decline in sexual frequency since the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously sex is plummeting. It seems like we live in this hypersexualized society, but we're actually having way less sex and there's almost less interest in real sex, which is, kind of counterintuitive, but, as we get into this, you'll see how it makes sense.
I wrote about that in Mating in Captivity that came out in 2006. That's 20 years ago. Yes, because in order to have sex with a female partner, if that's the man you're talking about, you need to be able to approach her. And so social atrophy is directly connected to what is often called the sexual recession. I mean, in Mating 20 years ago, I have an entire chapter where someone basically says to me, I'd rather have the security of an MBA than of a relationship. Okay, and at that point already, you began to see that adolescents in the United States, it's not everywhere in the world, but certainly in the US, and were more and more going in groups and having less and less pair bonding and less romantic relationships that accompany you through your adolescence, that develop with you. And you basically develop sex as part of a plot and not as something that at some point your hormones force you to do.
That's a really interesting point. So it's like she's building this idea that at the foundation of sexual relationships is really social interaction, right? And that makes obvious sense, right? Because we are social creatures and our romantic life should be an extension of that, right? It should be a fulfillment in many ways of the social sphere. And so, when that part gets disrupted, well, then obviously there's going to be a, trickle down effect or a chain reaction that causes the romantic side of things to get all screwed up.
But a relationship is a story. And then suddenly you arrive at a certain age and now you're looking at this other person with whom you want to have sex, and it's like this unknown continent that you have to conquer. But you've never spoken.
That's really true, right? Like, so we live in a world where guys are just like, they're not really interacting healthily with the opposite sex. It seems like so many guys are just retreating into their little world of, porn and video games and this kind of thing. And they're not interacting with women. And so when it's time to do that, it seems like this whole different thing. It seems like something foreign. It seems something disconnected. And I would say that this even starts to happen to a lot of guys who are married because, especially if you're around my age or older, then you formed your, marriage most likely in a time where things weren't so digitized yet. And when that happens, like, when you've gotten married, you built it in this world where you're generally connecting with other people, and then you shift into this digital world where those connections break down and you're leaning more and more on the digital stuff, then all of a sudden it's like you forget how to engage with your wife. This is something I see with guys that I work with. They don't know how anymore. They don't know where they're supposed to build in this connection with their wife so that it can lead to romantic fulfillment.
With those people. You have very little female friends who are just friends, who help you understand what happens with your girlfriend. There's an entire social map that has dissipated. So the sex is the last.
An important piece about this too is like a lot of guys, they're interested in how can I, find girls? How can I date them? And they're all focused on, practicing game and, approaching women and all this other kind of stuff. But The reality is like it used to be a lot simpler than that. Is like you would have a friend who was a girl, and sometimes she would just like hook you up with one of their friends, right? Like that's how I got my high school girlfriend, is like my male friend's sister. I was friendly with her, like she was kind of like a sister to me. And then her friend was the girl that I ended up dating because she kind of, set us up. And when you don't have that kind of social network, it becomes much more tricky.
Thing on the list of all these disconnects that then, of course, lead you to have this kind of statistic. Then that means with partners, they have plenty of sex, maybe with themselves and others, but it's partnered sex here that is involved, right? They have sex on porn. They have sex. They don't have partner sex, Do you understand when I say?
Yeah, there's a big difference there, right? There's a big difference between just sexual release, finding a recreational sexual partner, and building a relationship, having an actual romance, building something that could actually turn into a marriage, a long-term relationship, and that sort of thing.
To you, you can add that to your statistics too, that the majority of men who come to sex therapy today for erectile dysfunctions are young men in their 20s, not old men after prostate issues.
Really?
Yes.
Why?
Because they spend an enormous amount of time with themselves.
Watching porn and masturbating?
Yes, because in order to be able to maintain erections with a partner, it's an attunement, right? It's a resonance.
This is one of the most striking things for me when I first got into the sphere of helping guys quit pornography, like Gary Wilson's Your Brain on Porn stuff. It was like shocking to me to see how many guys were struggling with ED who were young, erectile dysfunction when they were young. Like I started doing this stuff back in like 2012, 2013. And it was like, yeah, the idea is that guys, they use porn and they masturbate so much that they train their brain to think that that is what sex is, right? And then when they're with a real woman, all of a sudden their brain doesn't process that as sex, and then their equipment doesn't work. And we've got like, 20-year-olds getting prescriptions for Viagra. It's insane.
It's grooving together. But if you've always just been by yourself, then you only know how to kind of be connected to your own physiological responses.
I've worried about this before. I've worried that if I watch pornography, that I will like desensitize myself to the real thing.
Depends how much, depends if what else is in your life. I mean, it's not an all or nothing thing. But what I'm saying is social atrophy, the gradual disconnect of the multiple touch points between people leads to then the challenges that are also sexual, leads to the kind of social isolation, leads to people confusing friends and friendship, so they can have 1,000 virtual friends but no one to feed their cat. It's all para.
No one to feed their cat.
Yeah, who would pick up a prescription at the pharmacy? Who may pick me up at the airport? Who will go check on someone I care about if I happen to not be there? Yes, who shows up for me? Because it's foundational to trust. Who can I lean on? Do you have my back? Can I rely on you?
So do you think the partnered sex is in decline because they're still having sex, but they're doing it on their...
The way she's talking about it here, it's like, it's a great point. It's like, okay, we have all these virtual friends or these virtual connections. We don't have real life connections. And obviously, like, if you can't have someone, you don't know anybody that can take care of your cat, well, that's a problem. But I would say that this also applies to even in the romantic married situation, where if your kind of relationship with your partner has become so kind of functional, it's become something where there is not a real, like she doesn't feel like she can really rely on you. She doesn't feel like she even knows you necessarily anymore. That's obviously going to have downstream sexual effects.
Do you have my back? And
sex is in decline. So do you think the partnered sex is in decline because they're still having sex, but they're doing it on their own now
partnered sex is in decline because social connection is in decline.
Boom.
Because people have less friends, because the statistics on who you call to when you are in trouble are really terrible. People have no one to confide in.
So how does that impact my sex with my partner?
Well, you won't have a partner usually. What this statistic says is that there is no partner. Young men between the age of 30 don't have sex with partners.
This one here from the British Medical Journal says that married couples in the UK and US report a steady decline in sexual frequency
Yes.
since
yes.
basically the internet.
Yeah. So here's how this works. How much time do you spend in front of a screen during the day?
9 hours.
All right. And then you sometimes think, now I'm going to go home and I finally can close the screens.
Yeah.
But then you're so tired that all you can do is watch TV.
Yeah.
And then while you watch TV, you're also scrolling on your phone.
Yeah.
And then while you're watching TV and scrolling on your phone, there may be somebody sitting next to you that does the exact same thing.
Yeah.
All right. And then somebody may even say something to the other person who goes,
Doesn't look at them.
How many of you guys have
Very
experienced that in your
And
relationships?
you really wonder why people are having less sex?
It's hard. It's hard.
I think that's probably the biggest thing that drives a lot of the married disconnect, is like people are just, they're more connected to their screens than they are to their partners.
But I'm going to say it is hard.
Right? So people are experiencing at that moment what I've come to call ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss is when I'm actually with somebody, but I don't feel the closeness, the intimacy, the connection from actually being with that person. I don't
we
know
all
if
know
you're
what that
here
is.
or not here. Ambiguous loss is actually a term that was developed by Pauline Boss, a psychologist, who talked about it when you have a person who has Alzheimer or dementia, and they are actually physically in front of you, but they are emotionally or psychologically gone. Or people who are deployed or have disappeared, or miscarriage, where people are no longer physically there, but they are emotionally very, very present inside of you. In both cases, you don't know, are they here or are they not? Do I say goodbye or do I hold on? When I am doing this,
Looking at your phone.
and I have like a still face, and I'm barely responding to you who said something that may be quite important, you don't know, are you here, but you're not present.
I think that's huge, right? And this is something that isn't always even just a technology issue, right? Obviously, the phones can trigger this kind of thing, right? We've all had this experience where we're trying to, talk to our, partner and girlfriend, wife, whatever, and you're trying to get their attention, talk to them about something serious, but they're like, yeah, all right. Right. And so that's what she's talking about. It's almost like you're talking to someone who isn't really there. But I would say for men, like, yeah, you can have the technology side, but then there's also where your head is just so in your work, for example. Like you can't put your work down. Like even when you're around your family, your mind's spinning about all this, this money I got to make or this project that I'm working on. And I'm so stressed. And you have that same sort of disconnect, right? Like you're there, but you're not really there. Right? Like you haven't actually put the work down when you go and you connect with your wife, you go and you connect with your family, and they can feel that. It's something that they can all feel very, very intensely. My daughter, she knows this. She can tell if I'm there or if I'm not. And then she gets, needy. She gets, very like, hey, daddy, pay attention to me. And I got to like snap myself out of it. It's so easy, particularly when you're an ambitious guy, to just get your head somewhere else and you're missing what's right in front of you. And when those connections start to erode, big problems start to arise. And so this brings us to the question of, well, what the heck are we supposed to do with this knowledge? If we understand now that a huge part of our romantic and sexual disconnect is downstream of social disconnect, how can we fix this? And I think the key really is you have to be a social leader, right? You have to take a leadership role in the connection process. Okay. And there has to be a bit of charity involved in this, meaning like you have to realize that a lot of people struggle with this sort of thing. And a lot of people are lazy around this. And you have to be willing to take that first step, often repeatedly. Okay. Like I've coached some guys before where, they wanted to start getting social, connecting with people, and they would start getting resentful that, I don't always want to be the one who reaches out. Of course you don't, right? It feels good when someone else initiates the connection. Right? But people struggle with this, and you have to be willing to be that guy who gets the momentum going, who is the one who is like, all right, I'll text my friends and get people together, right? I'll be the one who organizes it. I'll be the one who initiates. Okay. Same thing with your spouse. All right. You have to be willing to take charge there. All right. And it might not be one of those situations where immediately they're going to be starting to initiate. Okay. You can't play these stupid little counting games. Well, it's like, well, I texted you 3 times and then I just waited a week to see if you were going to text me. All right. Yes. All right. That does matter to some extent. But if you really want to start fixing this stuff, you have to have a bit of desensitization to it, because we're dealing with a world where everybody gets caught in their own shit so easily. They get sucked down into that digital rabbit hole so easily. And a lot of times people aren't aware of this. They aren't conscious of it, and they're not even trying to ignore you. It's just not even on their radar. So we have to have a certain resilience of spirit to be the one who initiates and who keeps initiating. Now, I'm not saying do this if someone shows like a lack of interest in connecting with you repeatedly. Obviously, they're just not interested. But very often people will respond, right? They will respond positively. And sometimes there needs to be a pattern generated, there needs to be some momentum gained before it starts feeling really reciprocal, okay? So how does this play out? Well, for the single guy, it means get out there and socialize, all right? Be that leader, be the guy who takes initiative, find that group of people, like go, even if it's just guys at first, right? Because if you can build a network of guy friends, well, guess what? All those guys, they know girls too, okay? And they can start helping you flesh out those connections. And then you'll realize that, all right, even if the romantic side doesn't pan out immediately, at least I've got friends, at least I'm doing stuff, at least I'm connecting. But usually if you're smart about it, then you're going to be able to start seeing those romantic opportunities come up, okay? Especially if you're going to be in that leadership role where you put together that get together where you invite some guys over and say, hey, bring some friends, okay? Or you put together that meetup and you say, hey, we're going to do this, like let's all get together, bring some people, that kind of thing, okay? Now, what about on the the married side of things? This is something that I've run into a lot with guys, is that they'll come in, they'll have these issues. Maybe they got a porn problem, their intimacy with their wife is really down, and they'll be like, well, I need the tactics. I need to learn how to hit on my wife again. I need to, learn game and frame and all this kind of stuff. And yes, there's definitely value and use to that. But where I always start is, how often do you actually connect with your wife? How often do you actually have like a heart-to-heart with her? How often do you actually have like time with her that's not just functional, where you are, getting chores done or taking care of the kids, okay? And so usually the first place is just figure out, how am I going to regularly connect with my wife as a person, right? Like on this social level, because that's where you start feeling like, oh, I've got a person here. I've got a relationship. I'm in a story with this person. We have shared experiences. I can get their feelings. They can get mine. We can have some fun. We can have some laughs together. That is the foundation, right? And once you have that, then you can start moving to the other pieces, right? Then you can start moving into, well, now I'm going to turn it into flirting. Now I'm going to turn it into escalation. Now I'm going to turn it to hey, let's get up to the bedroom and have some fun, right? But if you just try and jump to that without building that rapport and really maintaining that rapport day in and day out through, the ups and downs and the challenges of life, and there's not a security in that fundamental connection, then, the romantic part is just going to feel super forced and uncomfortable. So on the practical level, we can boil it down to just like take leadership on the social level. Build that social part first, then you can move into the more romantic components of things. But there's also the flip side here, where we have to make sure that our brain is equipped to do this kind of stuff. And that means reducing your screen time, reducing the amount of porn that you're using. Because even if you are doing these kind of social connections, but you're constantly just blasting your brain with porn, that's going to affect you, all right? You're not going to be able to connect as well. That's one of the biggest things I've seen with guys who struggle with pornography, is just their social circuitry is fried from porn or, excess video games. But typically porn is the big thing, okay? Because that just has a big kind of like effect on just the way that your brain seems to function, your level of confidence, your ability to just tune in and vibe with that person. Like she was saying that earlier in the talk, she was talking about how romance is it's a vibe, it's a dance, right? That is what it is. And in order for you to engage in that functionally, productively, you have to be able to sense the other person. And when you're using porn, that your ability to do that is just so damaged. And I've heard guys talk about this. It's one of the superpowers of NoFap, is that when they quit using porn, all of a sudden girls find them more interesting. And I don't think that's necessarily what's going on. I think what's going on is that they are more socially attuned. They're able to read the subtler nonverbal cues. They're able to read the social cues. They're able to read the conversational cues and respond to them authentically, naturally, with charisma, with their authentic self, rather than just being like this muted person who has just, blasted their social circuits, and then they're just kind of showing up as awkward, disconnected, whatever, right? Because there's like this fog that follows a person who is using porn regularly that really cuts off their vibrancy. It's like they're there, but they're not fully there, right? And that's a big problem. And so if you're looking for help on how to start quitting pornography, well, then I would love for you to click the training in the link where I teach you a special method that'll help you start attacking your cravings and living a life free from porn while getting more productive, reducing your stress, and generally enjoying your life a heck of a lot more. You can grab that training by clicking the link in the description. I think you'll really enjoy it. So hopefully you guys like this talk. Hopefully you got something useful out of it. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and always feel free to recommend other clips or things like that you would like to see me react to. All right, I'll see you on the next one. Ooh, yeah.